Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, welcome to the second webinar on methodologies and tools for Paris alignment. My name is Florencia Baldi. I'm here on behalf of FEPSI4S, Financial Centers for Sustainability Network. We're a collective of 36 financial centers working towards achieving the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. We represent 84 trillion equity market capitalization and manage about 82% of the global equity market. As I said, our overall objective is to accelerate the transition and expansion of sustainable finance by enabling financial centers to evaluate the state of sustainable finance in their markets, and also to provide them with tools and insights to engage local financial institutions and inform and influence policy. At FEPSI4S, we believe it is essential to have spaces like this where the focus is on achieving Paris goals, the Paris Agreement goals and other climate goals established in the NDCs, because we can support in this way the collective commitments that the financial centers adhere to, mainstreaming sustainable finance and helping build resilience in a global level. Well, so the idea of developing these webinars came from collaboration we did with the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, in which we studied sustainable finance commitments, and we analyzed a sample of them and concluded that although they have quintupled in the last decade, mostly of them are networks and are only focused in committing, whereas the Paris alignment process requires other steps, which are here in the color boxes, which are measurement of the alignment, target setting, which we are going to see in a while, that this tool also helps address. Steering, that's kind of how are they going to achieve Paris alignment. Tracking progress, that relates to evaluating the state of the work that they are developing in this regard, as well as reporting. So although financial institutions have collectively stepped up to advance aligning their portfolios, there are challenges operationalizing these steps. That is why for example, only a third of the sampled initiatives and commitments did have a climate alignment tool or methodology. So in that sense, we felt that it's really a lot of work ahead still to do, and it's important to showcase these initiatives. So today we will be talking about PACTA, that's the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment. That's a free open source tool which measures portfolios alignment with climate scenarios which are consistent with the Paris Agreement. PACTA has already been used by over 3,000 institutions worldwide, and it has been used also by supervisors and central banks like the Bank of England and the California Insurance Department to assess the regulated entities. And on average, about 600 portfolios are monthly assessed with this tool worldwide. So today I'm here with George Harris, who is going to introduce PACTA to you, also by Nicholas Dodd, who is going to focus on the metrics side of this tool to explain the metrics, and Nayra Herrera, who leads on PACTA for investors. So the three of them are going to explain the role of PACTA plays in the overarching process of reaching Paris alignment. And I'm also here, I'm glad to present Imen Reheb-Msa, who is the head of CSR Methodologies and Data at BNP Paris. That's, as you know, one of the largest banks in the largest bank in Europe, and managing having a banking portfolio of around 2,000 billion euros. He's going to explain how has BNP applied the PACTA methodology, and he's going to focus on some challenges and the impact of having applied this methodology. Okay, so before I leave the floor to them, 3 administrative issues. First of all, we would love to hear from you. So please, during the session, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box. We're going to address them at the end in a Q&A session. Second of all, a link of the recorded webinar is going to be sent to you by email. And third, if you're sharing this event on social media, please do not forget to tag ourselves at FC4S Network or at 2 Degrees Invest, so that we can be there. Okay, I'll leave the floor to George. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And thank you to FC4S for organizing such events. I'm sure it's a lot of the attendees and participants on this call are very aware. There's a multitude of different methodologies and tools on the market at the moment. So I think it's really important that we take the time to explain the different methodologies and also the kind of different approaches that they take and the different use cases that can be derived off the back of them to help equip the financial institutions to tackle this climate change issue. So I think in light of that, it's really great that we have people like Irene from BNP Paribas, who will be speaking later, who are really thought leaders in the space, have adopted this tool and have their own experience on this. So with that, I thank the FC4S and also Irene from BNP for joining us. And I really, really encourage participants to ask any questions that you might have through the chat box throughout this presentation. So now I've said that, I'd like to quickly run you through who we are at 2 Degrees Investing Initiatives. Then we'll move on to the different versions of PACTA. So we have PACTA for banks, we also have for investors, and we have kind of these coordinated projects. So I'll introduce those. We'll then move on to what PACTA can be used for. So defining some of these use cases. I'll then give a quick overview of the methodology and then hand over to my colleague Nick, who will take you through a deeper dive into the metrics and also how to implement this. So with that being said, I'll move on to who we are at 2 Degrees Investing. So we're founded in 2012. We work globally, got offices in Paris, New York, Berlin, Brussels, and London. Also got an emerging work stream in emerging markets. So we're a collaboration. We work with financial institutions and other NGOs, universities, policymakers, and supervisors, and we're not for profit. So we don't have any commercial side to what we do. We make free, public, open source goods that we deliver to the market. Next slide, thank you. So what do we actually do? We work across 4 broad work streams. So the first work stream, which is what we're here to talk to you about today, is PACTA. So it's our climate scenario analysis tool. We then have a separate work stream on retail investing. So this is looking at kind of preventing greenwashing in the retail space and equipping retail investors with the knowledge to make kind of consumer preferences around sustainability goals. So it's kind of our retail piece. Then we have a piece on impact. So looking to see what actions financial institutions make with relation to climate change and what actual impact that has in the real economy. So how the actions of FIs can influence the real economy to help drive decarbonization efforts in the real world and how we can kind of evidence that and if we can evidence that. Then finally, we have this work stream on long-term risk. So this looks at kind of supervisory policy in the long term, how we incorporate kind of long-term risks such as climate change, but also some other risks, pandemics, for example, biodiversity. Within this work stream, we also have our stress testing work. So as you'll see throughout this presentation, PACTA can be used for different use cases, one of which is risk management. The risk management piece is naturally flows into the stress testing, which is within our long-term work stream. Great, move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So PACTA, our first research stream. This is a climate scenario analysis tool, and it can be used by different actors in the financial system. So the first one is PACTA for banks. This is looking at corporate lending, and it was road tested with 18 major banks. You have one of which on the call today. You'll be hearing from later. So you can see these all at the bottom of the screen there. And since we released this in September of 2019, no, sorry, September 2020, it's been used by over 70 banks. When I say used, yeah, it's been downloaded by over 70 banks. And this comes in the form of a desktop software and supporting toolkit. Nicholas will take you through what that actually means in a couple slides' time. So that's PACTA for banks, corporate lending. Then we also have PACTA for investors. So this looks at shares, corporate bonds, and funds. And this is, yeah, for investors. It's been used by over 3,000 financial institutions. And this is an online tool. So here is kind of an interactive report. And again, I'll leave Nicholas to discuss this later. Then finally, we have these, what we refer to as PACTA COP projects. COP here standing for Coordinated Projects. So this combines the two former ones. So corporate lending, shares, corporate bonds, and funds. And it gives you a meta-analysis at kind of the country level. So 2DII implement this with regional partners. You can see some of the examples that we've done this with on your screen at the moment. Great, if we can move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So what can PACTA be used for? So PACTA in itself is a climate scenario analysis tool. So we're measuring the alignment of your portfolios to climate change scenarios. I'll go into what climate change scenarios actually are in a couple of slides' time. That's the kind of research question that we're answering with PACTA. How aligned am I to climate change scenarios? So what can this then be used for? It can be used to inform risk management, can be used in climate-related decision-making and formulation of strategies, can be used in target setting, can also be used to identify and engage with clients. And finally, it can be used in disclosure and reporting. So you'll know that the TCFD recommends you use scenario analysis, and that's exactly what this tool is. We have some examples on the right-hand side of banks that have used this within their reporting. And if you want to reach out to us following this call, we can also share some further examples. Next slide, please. Great, so we'll move on to methodology. So how does this actually work? And what are these climate change scenarios that I've been talking about? So the first thing we have on the right-hand side of the screen is we have physical assets in the real economy. So what does this mean? For the oil and gas sector, for the coal sector, we have the physical oil fields, oil extraction wells, and coal mining. We then have the power sector. So this is power plants, so the generation of electricity. Then for steel, cement, and automotive, we have the production values of the number of cars, the tons of steel, the tons of cement. Aviation, it's the airplanes, and shipping is still under development. So we have this bottom-up asset level data where we know the forward-looking production forecasts of each of those sectors I just defined, and we know that forward-looking up to 5 years. So we know how a automotive manufacturer, for example, is changing its production from high carbon technologies, internal combustion engines, into electric vehicles, for example, or how they're not doing this. And we know this forward-looking for 5 years. We then map those physical assets to the companies that own them, then the companies that own them, and on and on. And then what we do is we map those companies via the securities they issue or via the loans that financial institutions give to them to the financial institutions' portfolios. There's a slight divergence here in how we do that for corporate lending and for the investors, but I won't go into too much detail of that now. You're welcome to ask questions on that in the Q&A. The high level of it is that we map these assets to the companies and those companies to the financial institutions. Then, moving to the left-hand side of the screen, we are mapping these portfolios to the different climate change scenarios. Again, I'll define these scenarios in a slide's time. And once we've got those climate change scenarios, we then give an assessment of your alignment to those climate change scenarios. We do this across 3 different metrics, and the metric that is used is defined by the sector that we are looking at. Important to note there, the PACTA is always looking at alignment on a technology and a sector level. We're not aggregating it to the portfolio level, although there are ways in which you could do this. But what we perceive to be more actionable and steerable is to keep to a sectoral approach. So I'll break down the sectors and the metrics in a couple slides' time. But just a note for now, you get a technology mix, volume trajectory, so that's looking at production volumes, and emission intensities. And next slide, please. Great. So what am I talking about when I say these climate change scenarios? This is a very quick introduction. This is an infinitely complex topic, so I'll try to do my best to summarize it here. So we have, from the climate change scientists, they can define carbon budgets. So we know that a carbon budget of the globe is correlated with a temperature rise. So we know that as CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. So we can extrapolate that forward looking. So if we say that we want to limit global warming by 2 degrees, the target set out by the Paris Agreement, we can define a rough carbon budget for this. So that's kind of where the climate science comes into it. Then we move on to the kind of societal and economic factors. We know that in the future, population's going to grow, economy is going to grow, political considerations, demographics, all these kind of societal and economic factors are going to play a role in the way the world moves. So the question we then have to ask ourselves is, how do we stick within this carbon budget whilst allowing for the world to evolve as it needs to evolve? So what we do is we break this into different sectors, the kind of climate critical sectors, as you can see on the screen at the moment. So these are the sectors that contribute the most to climate change. The most notable exceptions here are agriculture and real estate, which are currently not included in the scope of PACTA. So maybe there you need to look for a different methodology, but also open to ideas of including these in the future. So within these sectors, we know there are different kind of pathways that these sectors can follow to achieve the societal and economic goals to maintain within the carbon budget. If you go to the next slide, I'll give an example of this. Great, thanks. So we know in the year today, 2020, or last year even, that since pre-industrial time, temperature's risen by 1 degree. This is purely hypothetical, and let's imagine that 10 gigawatts of energy come from coal-fired power generation today. Then we need to fast forward to 2050, where we need to maintain below 2 degrees, and we need a new technology mix. So we click on the next button, we should see this. Thank you. So we need to change our technology mix. We need to go to 7 gigawatts of renewable energy, and we can also maintain 5 gigawatts of coal. You'll notice that this doesn't add up to 10. This is accounting for the fact that population's grown, economies developed, etc. So there are different ways in which we can achieve this. These are the different scenarios that are produced by different third parties. For example, the International Energy Agency, the ones you see on the right-hand side. So we have the IEA makes scenarios, the JRC, which is European, EU, Joint Research Committee. Then we all, or Center even. The last one there, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance commissioned some scenarios as well. And there may be more. But what PACTA is doing is it's measuring your alignment against these different technology roadmaps, if you will, in these climate relevant sectors based on those production values. So into the sectors, and then I'll hand over to Nick. One important point to note is we're looking at that kind of key climate relevant segment within the value chain of those climate relevant sectors. So again, that's for the fossil fuel sectors, it's the upstream part. For power, it's power generation. Automotive, it's car manufacturing. So for those top sectors, we have well-defined technology roadmaps. The modeling community that I just described before, they have worked out that to keep within the climate goal, technologies have to evolve based on these roadmaps. In these cases, we give a technology or a fuel mix and also production volume trajectory. So how are your production values that you finance evolving over time? Then you can start to think how you can influence that as well. Then for the remaining sectors, sorry, go back quickly so it makes steel, cement, and aviation. Please note that shipping is still under development. We don't have such good technology roadmaps. As and when they come available, we will add them to the former metrics, but to date, we don't know the technologies and how they have to evolve. What we do know is the emission intensities that come from these sectors and how that must decrease. In which case, we give an emission intensity metric. Great, thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Nick, who will do a deep dive into some of these metrics. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, George. Okay, so I'm going to look at the three main types of metrics that we provide with PACTA, which you can measure alignment using, and also what they can, and give you some examples of what they can tell you and how they're illustrated in the results. So we have technology fuel mix, volume trajectory, and also emission intensity. And particularly the first two I'm going to show you are very much, as George has emphasized, we've chosen them because they're very much, we see them as being actionable because they're linked to changes in the underlying assets that are held by a company in terms of, for example, their production of vehicles, their capacity to generate electricity. So they're very much directly a measurement of those assets. We think that that's more actionable. So the first one is technology fuel mix. With this one, you can see for the sectors of fossil fuel production, oil, gas, and coal, power generation, and vehicle production, you can track and measure alignment according to the sort of increase in the low carbon production of low carbon technologies that we might want, that the scenarios look for more of, for example, electric vehicles, renewable power generation. But you can also see whether a company is reducing its production of, for example, internal combustion engines, coal-fired power generation. Now, for the companies that where you're in your portfolio or loan book, for the companies that you have that are in these climate relevant sectors that PACTA focuses on, we're able to measure the exposure of the portfolio and the sort of sector or pockets in that portfolio to these different technologies. And what you see here in the example results on the slide, in the first stacked bar, you can see the exposure in the power generation sector pocket of a portfolio. You can see the exposure to the different technologies: coal-fired power generation, oil generation, gas generation, hydroelectric, nuclear, and renewables. You can see at the moment it's exposed mainly to fossil fuel generation. You can then see in the second stack bar how the comparison with the market. In the case of the investor tool, that's an indices, the companies in an indices. In the case of banks, it's the investable universe. In the third stacked bar, you can then see, based on this forecast planned production data that PACTA runs up, that is able to make use of, you can see how the portfolio as it is projected to change with a small increase in renewables, exposure to renewables. Stacked bar 4, you can then see how it should change if it were to be aligned with the IEA SDS scenario, which is a 2 degrees Paris aligned scenario. So you can then compare 3 and 4, and you can see that actually the portfolio in 3 is misaligned. It's not going far enough in terms of planned investment in renewables. And in the 5th bar, you can see how the market as a whole would evolve in terms of alignment. Is projected to evolve in terms of alignment with the SDS scenario. So you can really see here the present position in terms of exposure to technologies, and also how that's forecast to change, and how it should be if it was to be aligned on this 5-year forecast. Next slide, please. Okay, another metric is production volume. So previously saw just a percentage split of technologies. Here you see an actual measurement of the change in production of vehicles, for example, or in terms of power generation. And yeah, we do this for the same sector: fossil fuel production, power generation, and vehicles. And you'll see here what we're able to do is plot the production trend, the forecast production. Here you see portfolio 1, and actually show to what extent is it aligned or misaligned with the different scenarios. Now the colors illustrative of the different scenarios. If you look, the blue is actually the market and indices or the investable universe, and you see that's misaligned at the moment with a current policy scenario of more than 3 degrees. The black line, portfolio 1, is performing better, but it's still misaligned. It's on a sort of current policy projection of more than 3 degrees as well. And actually we can also plot individual company results, and the sort of dashed line, company A, is actually performing better and is actually aligned with an IEA SDS 2 degree scenario. And in fact, if you wanted to show very strong alignment with Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees, you'd be into the dark green beyond 2 degrees scenario, or possibly we've also introduced net zero scenarios here as well into some of these results. Next slide, please. So just a note on the previous slide, these are shown technology by technology, so you can actually analyze the exposure and the trajectory for each technology: coal-fired power generation, production of electric vehicles, or in fact reduction in, for example, fossil fuel production by an oil and gas company. You can actually track the exposure and alignment there as well. Next slide, please. For the investor tool, we can actually show, for vehicle manufacturing and power generation, there are some results at company level. So you can actually, for the companies in which you hold equity positions or also hold bonds in an investment portfolio, you can see here on this bar chart the weight of the holding on the right hand side, and for each company your exposure within that holding to the different mix of technologies. And you can see here, you can see the variation in exposure to production of conventional internal combustion engines, and also which sort of predominates in the chart here. And you can also see who are leading the dark bars on the production of electric vehicles. At the top there, you can see the performance, the sort of weighted performance of the portfolio for vehicle manufacturing, and actually where the portfolio would need to be in terms of alignment on this forecast production. You can see it's misaligned at the moment, and there would need to be further investment by those companies in electric vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, and the third metric is, sorry, the title's wrong, is emission intensity. So this we do for those sectors that don't have a technology roadmap or call it a clear transition of technologies that are manufactured. Here we're talking about steel, cement, aviation, and we're looking to introduce shipping. And what we do here is we use a methodology developed by the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, the sectoral decarbonisation approach with some modifications. And it's based on the normalisation of the CO2 emissions from the production to a unit of production, for example, a ton of steel. So the amount of tons of CO2 produced per ton of steel or ton of cement that's manufactured. And what we can do is actually look at what the scenarios tell us, which is the black line. You can see the projected or sort of anticipated reduction over time in the emission intensity from the scenario. This is just a 5-year window. The scenario will run through to 2050, so you can see what needs to happen in the first 5 years of the scenario. And what we'll do is we'll calculate. We calculate for the scenario for the companies in the portfolio in that sector the reduction pathway to converge over time with the pathway in the scenario. So you can see the blue line is the start of that convergence, and you can use that for target setting as to check that to sort of track that companies in that sector are moving in the right direction, or maybe even be ahead in terms of reducing their emission intensity. And you can also benchmark against an index or the investable universe as well. So this is how the emission intensity can be used. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Okay, and now we've spoken about the metrics methodology. How can you actually go ahead now following this presentation today and pick up PACTA and use it and implement it to portfolios or loan books? So the next slide. Firstly, if you're an investor, this can be done. We provide ability to use PACTA on an online through the Transition Monitor platform. So it's all done online. You have to register and have an account. Once you've registered, you can then upload portfolios, which would then be analysed, and that will produce a report online, in which you can also download, which gives you the kind of results from scenario alignment measurement for the portfolio by sector, showing exposures that we just shown on the previous slides, and using the different metrics that will appear in an online report. There's a format for uploading, an Excel format for uploading the data, where you have to provide the company ISINs, the value of the equities or bonds that are held, and the currency, and then that's what you then upload. It can, depending on the size of the portfolio, can take up to half an hour to process, and then you will receive the report. So that's the investor side. The next slide, please. And on the bank side, a little bit different. You can actually run this on the desktop. We've developed a free open source software which runs on R code, which comes in a number of components which you can download: the data handling, the company matching, and then the actual the alignment, scenario alignment measurement itself, which you can then choose the scenarios which you measure alignment against. That's supported by a methodology document, also some guidance on the use of scenarios, and also a range of training materials which will take you through the process of implementing PACTA. And also there are some webinars as well, which give you a bit more of an interactive feel for how to help you to use it. The data is provided, and this whole support is provided for banks, and the data, the company level data which it runs on, is provided through an agreement on how the data is used and is provided by a sister company, Asset Resolution. Okay, thank you. So just in summary, before I hand over to Irene, thank you very much for listening. We've basically provided a summary of how PACTA, who can use it, both on the investor and bank side, but also it can be used at national level by supervisors, even governments, to take a look at the whole sector. In terms of how it works, we've shown you that it measures alignment against a variety of scenarios using asset level data, which has production forecasts of 5 years. It measures alignment using 3 different metrics. 2 of those metrics are very much we see as actionable because they're linked to production of the companies and the underlying investments and assets of those companies. And I've shown you how you can apply it if you're an investor online and banks via the free open source software and the supporting guidance. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Irene from BNP Paribas.
Allô? Allô?
Imano, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you today our experience with PACTA. Next slide, please. I will start by briefly describing BNP Paribas climate risk management, of which climate alignment measurement is one of the tools. And then I will describe our journey with PACTA methodology. Next slide, please. The BNP Paribas Climate Risk Management System is part of an overall approach and is based on first the development of financing and investment policies to regulate activities in sectors with high climate risks, such as coal-based electricity production. It is also based on the creation of a list of excluded business activities, such as non-conventional oil and gas production and coal developers. It is also based on the publication of public positions which demonstrate the bank's interest in issues that may pose environmental or social risks, such as ocean-related activities. It is based lastly on the development and use of tools to manage and monitor such risks. In the next slides, I will talk about a case study of climate risk management tools, which is a methodology to measure our credit portfolio alignment with Paris Agreement goals. And as a reminder, Paris Agreement states that financial flows must be consistent with a low carbon strategy to keep global warming at a level well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees. And as a founding member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the group is committed to align its financings with 1.5 degrees scenarios. Next slide, please. Rather than starting a methodology from scratch, BNP Paribas chose to work with 2DI and the other Katiowice Banks, BBVA, ING, Société Générale, and Standard Chartered, to adapt the PACTA methodology initially developed for investment portfolios to loan portfolios. Indeed, the ambition was to contribute to standardizing alignment methodologies application to enhance comparability across banks for the benefit of stakeholders. Here you can see a summary of our journey with PACTA methodology. So in 2018, 2DI developed PACTA for investors. Between 2018 and 2019, 2DI piloted PACTA with a set of banks, as George explained earlier, and BNP Paribas was naturally part of that pilot group. In December 2018, BBVA, BNP Paribas, ING, Société Générale, and Standard Chartered committed to contribute to the development of an open source methodology and tools for measuring alignment in Katowice in Poland. That commitment is now known as the Katowice Commitment, and the signatories are called the Katiowice Banks. Between 2019 and 2020, Katiowice Banks and 2DI workshops took place in order to improve PACTA and to find ways to harmonize its application. And in practical terms, we met every 3 weeks in average, and we shared methods and thoughts, but never clients' information. We still meet regularly, by the way, with the other Katiowice banks to improve PACTA application and to discuss the other alignment measurement tools. Next slide, please. So why did Katiowice Banks decide to use PACTA rather than financed emissions methodologies, for example? We all know that transition drivers vary across sectors, regions, and also time frames. And the Katiowice Banks looked for methodologies that help first set the right incentives for taking portfolio reallocation decisions within each sector and not simply incentivize divesting from most emitting sectors, since we are diversified banks and we strongly believe that each sector has its own transition strategy that should be reflected in the methodology. Also, we needed to define metrics that can easily be measured, monitored, and steered, and are not volatile or dependent upon changes except naturally for changes in the client's alignment or the bank's portfolio decision. Indeed, we are familiar with managing portfolios using financial criteria, and in order to lend credibility to the portfolio alignment approach, we needed to make this extra financial topic comprehensible to financial actors. This is met by PACTA, which offers ways to monitor alignment based solely on counterparties' climate materiality and banks' portfolio decision. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see PACTA major events of September 2020. On 15 September, 2DI published the PACTA methodology for credit portfolios with an online tool. These are 72 pages of academic material. 1 week later, Katiowice Banks published their application paper. These are 50 pages of highly practical illustration of inquiries and methodology choices. So why did the Katiowice Banks decide to write the application paper? The first ambition was to help standardizing the methodology application to enhance comparability across banks for the benefit of stakeholders. And sometimes we suggested improvements to the PACTA methodology to ensure that the indicators developed are enablers of the transition, like for the fossil fuels sector, for example, where we suggested to use additional indicators that were not part of the standard PACTA metrics. The idea was also to share our understanding of the sector issues and transition drivers. And the last aim was to share our operational feedback to help other banks with the methodology implementation. Next slide, please. PACTA methodology can be used for the following use cases: scenario selection and target setting, monitoring and reporting, steering and engagement with clients. In the next slide, you can see that PACTA can be used for target setting. And as you certainly know, PACTA is scenario agnostic. This means that it can accept different climate scenarios or benchmarks, provided that they are scientifically defined and Paris aligned, and that the desired indicators are provided. Within PACTA methodology, there are two approaches to define the trajectory the portfolio should follow to meet the end target. The first one is called the convergence or market approach. It specifies that the portfolio indicators needs to adjust at the same level as the scenario benchmark, independently of the indicator level at baseline. It is represented in the left graph. You can see that the portfolio target is equal to the scenario benchmark. Portfolio trajectory and scenario benchmark are intersecting in the portfolio target point. This is the Katiowice Banks preferred option, as it is easier to communicate and is connected directly with the level of the benchmark. The rate of change approach requires that all market participants make the same efforts independently of their past transition efforts. So the target trajectory has the same slope as the benchmark. You can see that both lines are parallel in the right graph. Next slide, please. So, sorry. I think that there's an issue with the title. So the second use case of PACTA is monitoring and reporting. So current portfolio climate performance and ideally projected one using clients forward-looking data are computed and used for portfolio monitoring. The banks could also report their degree of alignment. So you can find a BNP Paribas Power portfolio alignment analysis using a PACTA methodology in the annual report, for example. Next slide, please. The third use case of PACTA methodology is to steer the portfolio and to engage with clients. Aligning the portfolio can be achieved by divesting the misaligned clients, like the 3 clients below the black line in the graph, which represents the 2-degree scenario threshold. It could also be achieved by engaging with them and supporting that transition in order to improve their climate performance. The banking relationship is stronger and in some ways more intimate than the investment one. Indeed, when an investor decides to divest from a company, it just sells its share, while banks are tied with long-term financing contracts. Indeed, when BNP Paribas, for example, decided to divest the tobacco industry, it took, in average, 18 months to end the contracts. And because of this strong relationship with their clients, the engagement option is preferred by the Katiowice Banks in order to achieve the alignment of their portfolios. Indeed, we only choose to divest activities or clients when there is no possible transition, like thermal coal activities, for example. So what are the main lessons and next steps? The first lesson of our experience with alignment methodologies is that leveraging on an existing methodology using a collaborative approach fosters the exchange of operational feedbacks and sector experts' views, increasing thus the methodology robustness. In my opinion, the most important benefit of adapting an existing methodology that is adopted by other financial institutions rather than starting from scratch is probably to ensure that transition efforts converge toward the same actions, maximizing thus the impact on the real economy. So it is possible to build and to co-create together with 4 other banks and to share it, as explained earlier. Financial flows must be consistent with a low carbon strategy to keep global warming at a level well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. And this calls for engagement with customers to reorient their investment plans towards low carbon technologies and activities, to divert the investment flows from activities that are not compatible with their objective, and to bolster the financing of green activities. Next slide, please. A few issues are common to alignment methodologies and not only PACTA. Indeed, the availability of climate data to measure alignment is the main limit to that development. As of today, only listed companies and those operating in sectors subject to specific regulation, like automotive sector, report information related to their emissions. Moreover, the lack of standardized reporting framework for carbon intensity spurs the banks to use model data, which are by nature less accurate than reported ones, in order to ensure the consistency of their portfolio level climate performance. Integrated and diversified companies, general purpose lines should be partially included in the alignment analysis scope. However, the segmentation of the company's revenues by activity data is not automatically disclosed, and when it is disclosed, it is not easily comparable among the different actors of the same sector. Current available climate scenarios mainly focus on physical variables like the energy demand, the energy production, the vehicle quantity, etc. And financial variable scenarios like the energy capex scenarios that may be they may seem to be the most intuitive benchmarks to the portfolio mixes indicators, since they are expressed in the same unit, the percentage of euro invested or percentage of dollar invested. These are poorly documented. And as far as BNP Paribas' portfolio is concerned, the alignment study has been focused on the most climate relevant sectors. It will subsequently be expanded to other major GHG emitting sectors. Thus, further research is needed. So thank you for listening, and time for questions, if any.
Thank you very much, Imen. I think George is going to moderate this panel.
But yes, thank you so much, Imen. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump straight into answering some of these great questions. I think Imen's already started to answer them in her kind of conclusions there as well. So firstly, there's a question around, can you convert these production forecasts in the PACTA model into greenhouse gas emissions? So with this, okay, I guess the short answer is you can if you want to, but you don't really need to. So for us, the whole like theory of change, or the whole point of PACTA, is to keep it within these kind of production forecasts. As Men points out, this is kind of like the actionable lever to which you can influence in the future. This can also be forward-looking. This can also be consistent between different companies. So that comes to the second question, which is about the business competitiveness of production forecasts. So the way that the asset resolution data set is set up is based on business intelligence data providers. So they have a consistent, there will be a set of assumptions within that as well. This is based on kind of the announced capital expenditure of companies, a unit that's often well audited, as opposed to some other climate indicators that are variable between different companies. So we have kind of CapEx, well audited, forward looking. Then there's business intelligence providers that put their own kind of modeling on this. So they'll physically go to the power plants and do some due diligence to work out if this is like being accurate or not. So that's the second point, is that it's consistent between them. And the coverage, because it's another question, I can't tell you the exact figure, but it's significantly higher than self-reported emission data, I would say. If you want to know the exact answer to this, I encourage you to go to Asset Resolution website, where they will have some figures on this, and you can also reach out to them directly. So I hope that started to answer some of these questions. And then I see another one about can financial institutions with PCAF and PACTA, like, will the results be different? Kind of for the reasons I just explained, yes, the results could be different. So if you want to convert your PACTA production forecast into emission intensities, you can do this. You can apply emission factor units on top of the production forecast to get to a CO2 unit. But in doing so, you're introducing a layer of uncertainty and modeling assumptions. This may be different then to the self-reported ones that you've derived through your PCAF approach. So this isn't to say that the two will be different, like they are, no, sorry. This is to say that the two approaches are different, but not to say that they contradict each other. They can complement each other. I'm sure you'll hear from PCAF as part of this series and the kind of role that that plays. And then the PACTA one is slightly different. So if you are to converge the two, your answers might be different. If your answers are then different, that kind of, for me, highlights one of the issues of using modeled climate indicators, CO2 data in this case. So for that reason, I wouldn't encourage you to do it, but you can actually do it. One thing that PCAF has is this like hierarchy of data quality. I will leave them to explain it better than I will, but there is, I think it's probably towards the bottom, one of the options would essentially be using production forecasts, applying models to get emission data. That is PACTA, so you could use it for that. It's in that way they're kind of complementary. Okay, I know that was very quick. There's a lot of questions here. Nayra, were there any other particularly important ones you think we should go for now?
There's one regarding the convergence approach that we use in emission intensity. So the question is that for convergence approach, we use emission intensity metrics because it's the one that seems more applicable. And where can we find sectoral emission intensity scenarios?
Yeah, okay, so for the convergence approach to the emission intensity ones, yeah, this is when we don't know so well those technology roadmaps. So we convert to emission intensities, and the scenarios provide this. So the scenarios still give you production, but this will be tons of steel, tons of cement, and how that needs to evolve in the future. Associated with a ton of steel and ton of cement will be ton of CO2. Simply divide one by the other, and you get tons of CO2 per ton of cement. That is the kind of climate indicator that is being used within the emission intensity metric. Note that this is different to a CO2 per dollar. This is kind of a physical emission intensity unit, and that's what we're using in the emission intensity metric. just to disambiguate the difference between a convergence approach and a trajectory or rate of change approach. I think Amen went into this and did a great job of doing so. But the convergence approach is when you're converging on the scenario target, whereas the rate of change or market approach is when you're decreasing at the same rate of change as the market. So there's a difference between the two. An important point to note, and again, I think Amen's presentation highlighted this, is that PACTA is an open source methodology. So there are different ways in which you can implement it. Convergence versus trajectory are different approaches or ways of thinking about alignment. The methodology is free, it's open source, the tools are out there for you to use it at kind of no cost. If you then want to add to it or pick, you prefer convergence or you prefer trajectory, or however you want to do it, you're at will to do so. And that's exactly what you've seen BNP and the list of other banks doing as well. So I hope that kind of answers that a bit.
Yes, there's just one last question for Imen. So they're asking what proportion of the portfolio has been already analyzed?
I think that George kind of answered this question. So in general, PACTA sector cover around 20% of a typical diversified bank portfolio, but they cover around 70% of global GHG emissions. So yeah, it might seem to be a small portion of a portfolio that is covered by a PACTA analysis, but we should rather look at the share of emissions of financed emissions or attributed emissions to the portfolio that is covered by the PACTA analysis. That's the way that that we should look at this issue, and that's encouraged in the NZBA guidelines, for example, where the banks that committed to be net zero in 2050 are encouraged to cover a big share of their financed emissions.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like due to a time constraint, thank you all. Thanks for a brilliant presentation to my colleague panelists, and I would like to thank the audience for joining us today, and just say that next week we're going to focus on SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, as you can see here. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope this was useful to you as well. Bye-bye.